Welcome back to Beelzebub the Jag. If you saw the previous video, you won't be surprised to see me driving this old Volkswagen. It's my wife's car. It's impossible to drive the Jaguar at the moment, even though I did get it running. Having spoken to Adam, who runs Living with a Classic, fantastic YouTube channel, he sort of thought about it a lot, and he realised, I'm sure I mentioned it in the previous video, that the return valve had failed, and it was returning the fuel to the wrong tank. And because the tanks have been, one of the tanks, the right-hand tank's been disconnected, it's obviously, it was making it impossible to start the car on the right-hand tank. So it was drawing from the left and returning to the right, and very quickly the left was totally dry. It never occurred to me, because I've never ran it on the right-hand tank. As far as I'm concerned, it didn't run on there, didn't have any fuel in it, and I've never put any in there. And it did confuse me. If you look back at the other video, I was looking at the gauges and pressing around, and it showed the left-hand tank to be totally dry and the right-hand tank to be half full. And I thought it was some sort of electrical short circuit, to be honest. I didn't believe it to be the truth that there really was half a tank. It never occurred to me that it simply returned the fuel to the wrong tank. I know this can happen, but I thought that it was perhaps disconnected because that had failed some time ago. So as far as I was concerned, it had already failed, but never mind, I was wrong. And anyway, I got the car going, and I was trying very, very hard to sort of look into the tanks on the video and see which tank was returning. And on the video, neither seemed to be getting return feed, which in itself would be very unusual because the fuel pressure would be truly enormous. But I got a torch, and I needed two hands to hold the torch, and you need a little stick to hold the petrol tank open. And I could clearly see the fuel returning into the left-hand tank. It was being drawn from the right and then returning to the left. And within about 5 minutes, the right-hand tank was empty. There was a little bit of a dribble being returned to the right, but probably 95% going to the left. So as you can imagine, very quickly I'd have a problem. I'd be out of petrol again. Now, at that point, the car was running on LPG, and I filmed it running on LPG in the last video. And so it wouldn't, the car wouldn't have cut out. But what would have happened, because when the car's on LPG, the petrol pump, the fuel pump keeps turning. It still keeps pumping the fuel, and it pumps it up to the engine, but it bypasses the injectors and just gets returned to the tank. But it was returning to the wrong tank, and once it ran dry, the brand new fuel pump would have burnt out. The other thing is, obviously, if I stopped, I wouldn't be able to restart on petrol without faffing about and reconnecting the left-hand tank, which would then probably pump to the right. So I've just decided to leave the car behind in Brighton. I've got to return to Nottingham anyway, but I'll come back with a few tools and my manuals and this, that and the other. So it's a shame, but you don't get upset about these things when you drive an old car. It happens, you have to accept it. Most things on that car, it's bizarrely original, and most things are factory original, which in itself is quite rare. An old car's usually had probably, at least 25-30% of its components replaced at any time when it gets to 40 years old. But this one hasn't. It's still had its original water hoses, so nothing's been changed. It's a weird one. So, that's why I'm sort of going through the car, trying very, very hard to replace everything before they fail. But I'm afraid, the fuel system's beaten me. It broke before I got to changing everything. But we are, it is what it is, and I'll get it going. What I'll probably do, because it's going to be quite a big and quite an expensive job to get all of the valves, because there are 3 valves actually, one in each wheel arch. There's supposed to be a changeover switch in the boot, which has been removed. Then there's another, I'm not sure exactly, to be truthful with, I'm not sure where it's seated without going to the manual. So I'd need 3 valves and the changeover valve. It's probably going to cost 250, 300 in parts, and a huge amount of work. What I'm going to do, I think, is to get me going and to get me driving back to from Brighton back to Nottingham with the car. I can just work better there. I've got all my tools, I can jack it up. I'll pick up a fine in the street, obviously, but at least I can work. I'm going to attach the 2 pieces of the left and the right. One of them just dangles, it's just blanked off, so I'm going to attach them both together with a white piece. So what will happen, if I've got £10 worth of petrol in each tank, both tanks will drain at the same rate. And so it will be a relatively slow rate, because it will be, in theory, it will be drawing 50% of the fuel that ends up at the fuel rail. 50% will come from each tank, under sort of atmospheric pressure, really. Atmospheric pressure will bring it to the fuel pump, and it will be about 50-50 from each tank. There's nothing to stop me doing that. It will run perfectly fine, but the problem I'll have is when it returns, it will return to one tank or the other. It won't return to both. So we'll be drawing it off both tanks, then it'll be returning to one tank or the other, which won't be a problem, because once again, it'll, under atmospheric pressure, it will automatically feed the fuel pump. But of course, if I'd fill both tanks to the brim with petrol and drive it under atmospheric pressure will be feeding the fuel pumps, and I won't be selecting tank A or tank B, left or right. And if they're both filled to the brim, it will return to one tank or the other, and it will overflow whichever tank is being drawn from. It will overflow and run down the wing. But the simple fact, it will return nearly 50% more than will be drawn from the tank. Bear in mind, it will be drawing from two tanks. That two tanks will end up as one. It will get mixed at the fuel pump, and it will arrive at the fuel rail, and then, I don't know, 85-90% of it will be returned to the one tank or the other, and that will be at a greater rate than it will be being drained. So I will only be able to half fill them. It's not going to be that much of a problem, because the car does run on LPG, and wherever possible I run it on LPG. If the LPG is available, I buy it and run the car on that. So you only really need the fuel and the petrol to start the car, run it for about a minute or so until it automatically changes over. And that's where we were when it failed the other night. The engine was just warming in the first quarter to half a mile from home before the tank ran dry. It had pumped into the other tank, and I never thought to check, because as far as I was concerned, that tank didn't work and it wasn't connected. And it really sort of confused me when that tank was registered as half full, because I knew that I hadn't put it there, but it never occurred to me that the switch had failed and it had gone automatically. But I think that's what I'll do anyway. I'll get back to Brighton, and I'll connect the two together with a Y pipe. Then in the coming weeks, I'll really drill it down and get stuck in, because I don't want to be working in Brighton. It's far from ideal. My neighbours won't be as tolerant at my Brighton property. It's a lot more of a, how can I say it? It's, without wishing to sound, I don't know. It's just, the Nottingham address is slightly down at heel. The neighbours don't complain, even though the community protection complain. But in Brighton, they'd soon be complaining, and I accept that, and I wouldn't do it in Brighton. But most of my tools are not there, so I won't. I'll join the two together, and I'll run it through one pump, both tanks draining, and it won't matter which one it returns back to, so long as I can have access to that fuel without faffing about in the boot changing over. We should be okay. But I'm going to go now, because the road suddenly got rather dark. There won't be any more videos for a couple of days, because I don't have the Jaguar. It's now 120 miles back. I'm about 80 miles now into, left on the journey, and in my wife's car. So yeah, I'll have a really good think, study the manuals, but I'll almost definitely do the job properly in Nottingham. But I'll sort of do a temporary sort of connection when I get back to Brighton after the weekend.